Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases ever documented in the history of Louisiana. A case that historians deliberately buried for nearly 70 years. A case that reveals not just murder, but something far more terrifying. An entire society's capacity for collective self-deception. Before we begin, I want you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're genuinely interested in knowing to which corners of the world these forgotten stories reach, and at what hour of the night they find you. On the morning of August 23, 1848, the humid air of Louisiana hung thick over the eastern banks of the Mississippi River, the kind of heat that makes every breath feel like drinking warm water. A local merchant named Richard Caldwell was making his way down a muddy path just outside the growing settlement of Baton Rouge, when something unusual caught his eye. An abandoned carriage, its wheel partially submerged in the soft riverbank mud. The horses were gone. No driver in sight. Spanish moss dripped from the cypress trees overhead, swaying gently in a breeze that did nothing to break the oppressive heat. Inside the carriage, Caldwell found only 3 objects: a single leather glove, a ledger with absolutely no entries, and a silver locket, containing no photograph. The carriage bore the insignia of the Whitmore plantation, one of the largest and most prosperous estates some 5 miles east of the city. And here is where the mystery begins. Because when Caldwell reported his discovery to the Baton Rouge constable that very afternoon, it was noted that no one from the Whitmore household had been seen in town for nearly 3 weeks. Samuel Whitmore was a man of absolute precision, rigid in his habits, inflexible in his routines. Every Thursday, without fail, he visited the First Bank of Baton Rouge. According to bank records, he had missed 3 consecutive appointments. No word, no explanation, just silence. What the deputies found when they arrived at the Whitmore plantation that afternoon would become the foundation of one of the most chilling cases in American history. A case deliberately kept from official records for nearly 70 years. A case that, once you hear it, will change the way you think about truth, about society, and about the lies we tell ourselves. Subscribe now and stay until the very end, because what you are about to hear was never taught in any history book. The Whitmore plantation was a world unto itself. Sprawling across hundreds of acres of rich Louisiana cotton fields, it stood as a monument to wealth built on human suffering. The main house rose 3 stories high, its white columns gleaming in the southern sun like the bones of some great beast, surrounded by magnolia trees that cast long shadows over manicured gardens where roses bloomed in defiant beauty. Inside, crystal chandeliers hung from ornate ceilings, casting rainbows of light across polished hardwood floors. French tapestries adorned the walls, depicting pastoral scenes of shepherds and maidens that seemed to mock the reality just beyond the windows. Elizabeth Whitmore's parlor was filled with imported furniture from the finest craftsmen of Europe, fine china that had crossed the Atlantic in ships whose holds had once carried different cargo entirely, and silver that had been in her family for generations. The air itself seemed to carry the scent of privilege and entitlement, perfumed with flowers cut fresh each morning by hands that had no choice but to serve. But walk a quarter mile behind that grand house, past the kitchen gardens where vegetables grew for tables the gardeners would never sit at, past the smokehouse where meat was cured that they would never taste, and you would find the slave quarters. Rows of cramped wooden cabins, their walls thin enough to let the winter cold seep through and the summer heat bake those inside. 27 enslaved souls lived there, working the cotton fields from dawn until the last light faded from the Louisiana sky. Their hands bled from the cotton bolls. Their backs bore the marks of discipline. Their spirits were broken day by day, year by year, generation by generation. Samuel Whitmore was 46 years old, a man whose reputation for cruelty was whispered about but never spoken aloud. His face was lean, his eyes cold as the bottom of a well, his smile rare and never warm. He ran his plantation with the precision of a military commander and the compassion of a serpent. His wife Elizabeth was 42, a woman who had grown cold and distant over the years of her marriage. Whatever love had once existed between them had long since withered into bitter tolerance. She spent her days in the parlor, reading novels about romance she would never know, while her husband spent his nights elsewhere. Their 3 adult children still lived on the estate. Thomas, the eldest at 23, was already learning the business of the plantation, inheriting his father's ruthlessness along with his ledgers. He had his father's cold eyes and his mother's silent disapproval of everything around him. Catherine, 20, was beautiful and bored, trapped in a gilded cage of her father's making, waiting for a suitable marriage that would transfer her from one cage to another. And William, 18, the youngest, possessed his father's temperament and none of his patience. He was known to strike the servants for the smallest perceived offense, finding in their suffering a power he could not find elsewhere. And then there was Adeline Broussard. Adeline had been purchased by Samuel Whitmore in 1842 from a French family in New Orleans. She was educated, fluent in both English and French, with a grace that seemed out of place in her circumstances. Her skin was the color of polished mahogany. Her eyes held depths that most chose not to examine too closely. There was something in the way she moved, the way she spoke, that made people uncomfortable without knowing why. Officially, she was Elizabeth Whitmore's personal maid. Unofficially, well, the other servants knew better than to speak of such things. Some truths were too dangerous to put into words. A former field slave named Isaiah Cooper would later testify, Master Whitmore, he had a particular cruelty about him. Not the kind that leaves marks on the body where everyone can see, but the kind that breaks something inside. The kind that kills you slowly while you're still breathing. And Miss Adeline, she suffered more than most. For 6 years, Adeline endured what no human being should ever have to endure. She served Elizabeth Whitmore by day, attending to her every need, dressing her hair, laying out her clothes, fetching her tea. She was invisible and ever-present, a shadow that moved through the house without sound. But the nights belonged to Samuel Whitmore's darker appetites. Cooper would later say, what Master Whitmore did to Miss Adeline over those years, it changed her. Not all at once, but slowly, like water dripping on stone. There came a day when something in her eyes just wasn't there anymore, like a light had been blown out. By the summer of 1848, Adeline Broussard was approximately 30 years old. She had spent nearly a third of her life in bondage to the Whitmore family. She had learned every detail of how the household operated. She knew Elizabeth's mannerisms, her way of speaking, her habits, the way she held her teacup, the phrases she favored. She knew the family's secrets, their business dealings, their vulnerabilities, and she had learned something else too, something far more dangerous than knowledge. She had learned patience. When the deputies arrived at the Whitmore plantation that August afternoon, the late summer sun hung heavy in the sky, casting everything in golden light. Everything appeared to be in perfect order. The cotton fields stretched toward the horizon, rows of white bolls ready for harvest, swaying gently in the humid breeze. Field hands moved among the plants with practiced efficiency, their backs bent, their hands working, their faces revealing nothing. Smoke rose from the kitchen chimney. In the main house, servants went about their duties. Meals were prepared. Beds were made. Silver was polished. The estate hummed with the rhythms of daily life, as if guided by some invisible hand. It was as if the Whitmore family had simply stepped away for a moment and would return at any second. But they were nowhere to be found. Not Samuel, not Elizabeth, not Thomas, Catherine, or William. 5 people had vanished without a trace. No note, no message, no explanation. The deputies began their questioning with the house servants. What they heard sent a chill down their spines. Every single enslaved person on that property gave the exact same response, delivered in almost identical wording. Master Whitmore has gone to visit his brother in Natchez. He is expected back before the harvest. The words were spoken with flat affect, without emotion, without variation, as if they had been rehearsed, as if they had been memorized, as if they were reciting a prayer or a promise that had been drilled into them until it replaced the truth. There was just one problem with this explanation. Samuel Whitmore had no brother in Natchez. According to all available records, all birth certificates, all legal documents, all family histories, he had no brothers at all. He had been an only child. The deputies exchanged uneasy glances. The story made no sense, and yet everyone on the property repeated it with the same unshakable certainty. The only person who seemed out of place was Adeline Broussard. According to the other servants, she had taken to sitting motionless in the parlor when not attending to her duties. Hours would pass, and she would simply sit there, staring at nothing, her hands folded in her lap. When other servants approached, she would turn to look at them with eyes that seemed to see through them rather than at them. Eyes that held no fear, no submission, no servitude, just a vast, patient emptiness. When the deputies approached her for questioning, Adeline rose gracefully and spoke with perfect diction. "The family is away on business," she said. "I will be managing the household in their absence." She smiled then, a smile that one deputy would later describe as cold as river water in January. Over the following weeks, a quiet investigation was initiated. Neighboring plantation owners were consulted. And here is where the story takes its first, truly disturbing turn. No one seemed concerned. Like the slaves on the property, the white neighbors accepted without question that the Whitmores had simply gone away. When pressed for details, they became uncomfortable. They changed the subject. They looked away. They suddenly remembered pressing appointments elsewhere. They developed convenient deafness to certain questions. Judge Martin Lambert, a business associate of Samuel Whitmore, was the first to notice what he called the strange silence surrounding the case. In his private journal, discovered decades after his death, he wrote, "It is not merely that the family has disappeared. It is that no one seems to want to speak of it. It is as if the community has collectively agreed to look away, as if acknowledging the mystery might somehow make it real." Parish records from September of 1848 indicate that Lambert attempted to initiate a more formal investigation. His requests were denied. His concerns were dismissed. He was advised, repeatedly and with increasing firmness, to focus on other matters. But why? Why would an entire community choose to ignore the disappearance of a prominent family? What could possibly make them all look the other way? The answer to that question would take decades to emerge. And when it finally did, it would shake the very foundations of everything they believed about the world they lived in. By October of 1848, something extraordinary was happening at the Whitmore plantation. Something that defied all logic, all law, all understanding of how the world was supposed to work. The estate continued to operate as if nothing were amiss. Cotton was harvested, processed, and shipped to market. Profits were deposited in the Whitmore account at the First Bank of Baton Rouge. Bills were paid, supplies were ordered, correspondence was answered. But here is the truly chilling detail. The deposits were authorized by a signature matching Samuel Whitmore's own hand. The same flourish on the W, the same angle on the letters. Yet the man himself was never seen. Not at the bank. Not in town. Not anywhere. He had become a ghost who could still sign his name. And then the reports began to filter in about Adeline Broussard. The house slave who had once sat motionless in the parlor was now occupying the master bedroom. She had taken to wearing Elizabeth Whitmore's finest dresses, her jewelry, her imported perfumes. She slept in Elizabeth's bed with its silk sheets. She sat at Elizabeth's vanity surrounded by Elizabeth's mirrors. She used Elizabeth's silver hairbrush and Elizabeth's French cosmetics. But it was not merely the clothes that had changed. According to hushed accounts that Judge Lambert documented in his private notes, Adeline had begun to speak as if she were Mrs. Whitmore herself. She gave orders in a perfect imitation of the missing woman's voice and mannerisms. She received visitors in the parlor, offering them tea from Elizabeth's china. She discussed business affairs with merchants and tradesmen, using terms and phrases that Elizabeth had favored. She signed correspondence with Elizabeth's name, in handwriting that closely mimicked Elizabeth's own. The other house slaves, apparently terrified, complied without question. They addressed her as Mrs. Whitmore. They served her meals on Elizabeth's china. They curtsied when she passed. They pretended, because the alternative was unthinkable. In November, Judge Lambert interviewed a field slave named Moses, who had been caught attempting to flee the plantation. Before being returned to the property, Moses allegedly told the judge something that still echoes through the decades. "There ain't no Whitmores no more. Miss Adeline says there never was." After Moses was returned to the Whitmore plantation, he was never seen again. His disappearance was explained away as a successful escape attempt, despite the doubled patrols that had been established following his first attempt. Despite the dogs. Despite the reward posted for his capture. Moses had simply ceased to exist. By December, the strange pattern had become undeniable. Tradespeople and merchants who visited the property reported being greeted by Adeline Broussard, who now openly presented herself as Mrs. Whitmore. A milliner from Baton Rouge who had come to deliver hats ordered months earlier by Elizabeth Whitmore left this account. "The Negro woman received me in the parlor, dressed in Mrs. Whitmore's finest clothing. She spoke with perfect diction and addressed me as if we had met many times before. When I inquired after Mrs. Whitmore, the woman looked at me strangely and said, 'I am Mrs. Whitmore.' What disturbed me most was not her claim, but rather how naturally she seemed to inhabit the role, as if she had always been meant for it, an enslaved woman claiming to be the mistress of a plantation, in Louisiana, in 1848, in a society built on the absolute division between master and slave, white and black, human and property. The punishment for such presumption should have been swift and brutal. The law was clear. The social order was absolute. An enslaved person who dared to assume the identity of their owner would have been publicly tortured, executed, their body left to hang as a warning to others. The entire machinery of antebellum justice existed specifically to prevent such inversions of the natural order. And yet, nothing happened. No one called for her arrest. No one demanded an explanation. No one raised the alarm. No one summoned the slave patrols. The merchants took their payments. The neighbors continued their visits. The bank processed the deposits. The plantation operated as if the Whitmore family were simply away on an extended journey. Judge Lambert attempted to organize a more thorough investigation in January of 1849. His efforts were blocked at every turn. Local officials expressed reluctance to interfere with private plantation matters. Fellow judges advised him to let the matter rest. Anonymous letters arrived at his home, warning him to mind his own affairs if he valued his position. In a letter to his brother in New Orleans, Lambert wrote words that still send a shiver down the spine. Something has happened here that no one wishes to acknowledge. It is as if speaking of it might make it real. So they choose instead to look away and pretend. But what exactly had happened? What could possibly make an entire community participate in such an elaborate fiction? What truth was so terrible that an entire society would rather accept an impossible lie? The answer lay buried in the swampland at the far eastern edge of the Whitmore property, waiting to be discovered. In February of 1849, something happened that defies all logic. Something that proves this was not mere ignorance or oversight, but active, deliberate participation in a collective delusion. A daguerreotype was taken at the Whitmore plantation during a gathering of neighboring plantation owners. The image, which would surface in a private collection in 1931, shows what appears to be a formal dinner party. Around the table sit some of the most prominent white families in East Baton Rouge Parish. Men in formal evening wear, their starched collars gleaming in the candlelight. Women in their finest gowns, pearls at their throats, diamonds in their ears. And at the head of the table, where Samuel Whitmore should have been seated, sits Adeline Broussard. She is dressed in Elizabeth Whitmore's finest evening gown, the one imported from Paris. Diamonds glitter at her throat. Her hair is styled in the fashion of the day, swept up and pinned with Elizabeth's favorite combs. And the white guests seated around her, they are smiling, raising glasses, engaged in animated conversation, laughing at jokes, toasting to prosperity. Dr. Harold Bennett of Tulane University, who analyzed the photograph in 1934, wrote, "The expressions on the faces of the dinner guests betray no discomfort or awareness that anything is amiss. The African-American woman in Elizabeth Whitmore's clothing is being treated as if she were indeed the lady of the house. This is not ignorance. This is choice. This was not a secret gathering. This was not hidden from view." The white aristocracy of Baton Rouge sat down to dinner with a black woman who had taken the place of their vanished neighbor. And they acted as if this were completely normal. How is this possible? In a society built on the absolute separation of the races, in a time when the slightest breach of racial protocol could result in death? Dr. Catherine Monroe, a psychologist who studied the case in the 1970s, proposed a theory she called selective reality. It is a form of collective dissociation, where a group agrees, without explicitly stating so, to perceive a situation in a way that preserves their understanding of how the world should function. Rather than see a former slave who had done the unthinkable, a reality too threatening to their entire worldview, they saw what their minds could accept. A somewhat unusual social scenario where they were dining with the representative of the Whitmore family. Monroe wrote, "The human mind is remarkably adept at reframing reality when the alternative is too psychologically damaging to contemplate." But there was another factor at play, one that the wives understood perhaps better than anyone. Decades later, an elderly woman named Josephine Taylor, who had been a house slave at a neighboring plantation, would reveal a truth that had been kept for generations. It wasn't just that they pretended not to see. Some of them, the wives especially, they understood. They knew what their husbands were. They knew what happened in the slave quarters after dark. They'd sit with Miss Adeline, take tea with her, discuss household matters, all the while knowing exactly who she was and what she'd done. And in their eyes, there was something like admiration, maybe even envy. When asked to elaborate, Taylor reportedly said, "There were other wives who wished they could do what she did, not just to be free, but to make the ones who hurt them pay. They lived through her. That's why they protected her. That's why they saw her as Mrs. Whitmore. Because in another world, maybe they could have done what she did. Maybe they wanted to. If this story is touching something deep inside you, take a moment to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters. Your witness matters. Because these stories only survive when we choose to remember them. Not everyone was willing to participate in the collective delusion. Not everyone could make themselves look away. In 1968, a collection of letters was discovered during renovations to an old home in the Garden District of New Orleans. Hidden behind a false panel in a secretary desk, they had waited for over a century to be found. They were written by Caroline Beaumont, Elizabeth Whitmore's sister, to her husband who was serving as a diplomat in France. In September of 1848, Caroline wrote, "I have received no word from Elizabeth since my letter of July. I have written twice more and dispatched a messenger to the plantation, but have been informed that the family is traveling. I find this most unlike my sister, who has never been fond of leaving home. Elizabeth hated to travel. She said the dust of the roads irritated her lungs. Why would she leave without word to me?" By November, her concern had deepened into something closer to fear. I attempted to call at the plantation myself, but was received by Elizabeth's maid, Adeline, who insisted that the family remained away on business. There was something in her manner that disturbed me greatly, though I cannot say precisely what. She spoke as Elizabeth might, used expressions familiar to my sister. When I pressed her on when the family might return, she smiled in a way that chilled me and said, "They are never coming back, but we need not speak of that." Caroline shared her concerns with Judge Lambert. Together they tried to raise the alarm, but they were met with indifference and hostility at every turn. Doors that had once been open to her were now closed. Friends who had once welcomed her visits now made excuses. In January of 1849, Caroline wrote her most desperate letter. "I called upon the Bradfords, who claimed to have dined with my sister just the week before. When I insisted that this could not be true, that I knew Elizabeth was not at the plantation, Mrs. Bradford became quite cold and suggested that perhaps I was unwell, that perhaps the strain of my situation had affected my nerves. I am beginning to question my own mind. Is it possible that I am indeed mad? And yet I know my sister. I know she would never leave without word to me. Something terrible has happened at that plantation, but it seems I am alone in my certainty." Shortly after this letter, Caroline returned to France to join her husband. There is no record of her ever returning to Louisiana. In 24 additional letters discovered in the same collection, she never again mentions her sister or the Whitmore family. Not once. As if Elizabeth had never existed. It was as if, unable to reconcile what she knew with what society insisted was true, she chose to excise the matter entirely from her life. To survive, she had to forget. The one person who refused to accept the lie was slowly pushed to the margins, her sanity questioned, her voice silenced. And meanwhile, at the Whitmore plantation, Adeline Broussard continued her impossible masquerade. The most comprehensive account of what truly happened to the Whitmore family comes from an unexpected source. A voice from the past that refused to be silenced. In 1865, following the end of the Civil War, a former slave from the neighboring Bradford plantation named Isaiah Cooper provided testimony to a Union Army officer documenting conditions in the recently liberated territories. Cooper's account, preserved in military archives until 1948 when it was finally declassified, describes events that occurred on the night of August 1st, 1848. 3 weeks before Richard Caldwell discovered the abandoned carriage. Cooper claimed to have been present at the Whitmore plantation that night. His testimony paints a picture of horror, vengeance, and a silence that would last for decades. "It had been building for years," Cooper told the Union officer, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was revealing. "Master Whitmore, he had a particular cruelty about him. Not the kind that shows on the outside, not the kind that leaves scars you can see, but the kind that breaks something deep inside a person. The kind that kills you slowly while you're still breathing. And Miss Adeline, she suffered more than most. What he did to her over those years, it changed her. Not all at once, but slowly, like water dripping on stone. There came a day when something in her eyes just wasn't there anymore, like a candle that had been blown out, like she had gone somewhere else and left her body behind. The night of August 1st began with an elaborate dinner prepared by Adeline herself. The entire Whitmore family was present, Samuel at the head of the table, Elizabeth opposite him, and their 3 children arranged along the sides. The dining room glowed with candlelight. The finest china was laid out. Crystal glasses sparkled. The meal was exquisite. Course after course, prepared with meticulous care. The finest dishes from the Whitmore kitchens. Nothing seemed unusual, Cooper testified. They ate. They talked. They laughed. Miss Adeline, she served them just like always, moving quiet between the kitchen and the dining room. But there was something different about her that night. Something calm. Like she had made peace with something. Like she already knew how the night would end. It was after the final course, after the dessert had been served and the coffee poured, that the family began to display signs of distress. They was grabbing at their throats, their eyes bulging. Master Whitmore, he tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't hold him. He fell back into his chair, and he looked straight at Miss Adeline like he finally understood something. Like after all those years of using her, of treating her like she wasn't human, he finally saw her for what she really was. And Miss Adeline, she just sat there watching them all, calm as still water. She didn't say nothing. She didn't do nothing. She just watched. Cooper paused in his testimony, and when he continued, his voice was barely above a whisper. They died hard. It took most of the night. Miss Adeline, she sat with them the whole time, watching. When young William tried to crawl toward the door, she didn't stop him. She just watched him fall. When Mrs. Elizabeth begged for mercy, Miss Adeline just shook her head, slow and sad, like she was watching something inevitable. When it was finally over, when the last one stopped moving, she stood up and smoothed her dress like she was about to receive visitors. Cooper's testimony suggests that Adeline Broussard had poisoned the entire Whitmore family at dinner that evening. 5 people. 1 meal. 1 woman who had finally reached the end of her endurance. But what happened next transcends the merely disturbing and enters the realm of the incomprehensible. Miss Adeline, she gathered all the house slaves in the kitchen. She told them, "The Whitmores have gone to visit family in Natchez. I will be managing the household in their absence." And then, this is what I still can't make sense of even after all these years. Everyone just nodded like this was perfectly normal. Like they hadn't just seen what I'd seen. Like the bodies weren't still warm in the dining room, under cover of darkness, while the moon hid behind clouds as if unwilling to witness what was to come. Adeline directed several trusted field slaves to carry the bodies to the swampland at the far eastern edge of the property. The ground there was soft, always wet, hungry, the kind of place where things could disappear and never be found. 5 graves were dug in silence. 5 bodies were lowered into the Louisiana mud, and by morning, it was as if the Whitmore family had never existed. After that night, Cooper continued, it was like reality itself had shifted. Miss Adeline, she started wearing Mrs. Whitmore's clothes, sleeping in their bed. At first, just around the slaves, but then when visitors would come, she'd receive them just like she was the lady of the house. And the white folks. They'd come to dinner, sit at her table, converse with her like she was one of them. Cooper paused in his testimony, and his next words cut to the heart of the mystery. It wasn't that they were fooled. They knew who she was. It was like they chose not to see what was happening, like it was easier to pretend. But why? What made an entire society participate in this impossible fiction? Judge Lambert, in his final writings on the subject, perhaps came closest to the truth. They cannot acknowledge what has happened without acknowledging what preceded it. And that, it seems, is the one thing they cannot bear to face. To admit that Adeline Broussard had killed the Whitmore family was to admit why she had done it. It was to confront the truth of what Samuel Whitmore had been. What all of them had allowed to happen in the name of the social order they had created. What they themselves might have done, or allowed, or looked away from. It was easier to pretend, easier to look away, easier to accept an impossible lie than to face an unbearable truth. For nearly 18 years, Adeline Broussard lived as the de facto mistress of the Whitmore plantation, a slave who had become a master, a possession who had possessed. Bank records uncovered in 1966 tell a remarkable story of her careful stewardship. After August of 1848, while the plantation's business operations continued, new patterns emerged in the accounts. Patterns that revealed a different kind of master. There were purchases of medical texts and French-language books from a New Orleans bookstore, payments to a tutor who visited the plantation twice weekly, and most remarkably, there are records of payments used to purchase freedom papers for 3 individuals described only as former property of neighboring estates, a slave owner using plantation profits to free other planters' slaves. This extraordinary transaction apparently went unremarked upon by bank officials. Just another entry in the ledger, just another thing not to see, just another impossibility accepted as normal. In 1851, the accounts show the establishment of a separate account in the name of A. White, with an initial deposit transferred from the Whitmore holdings. This marked the beginning of a financial transition that would eventually lead to something unprecedented. A new identity being carefully constructed, one transaction at a time. In 1853, a fire destroyed most of the main house. No deaths were reported. The property was rebuilt on a more modest scale. Some whispered that the fire had been deliberately set, that it had consumed whatever evidence might have remained of the Whitmore family's final night. Operations continued through the turbulent years leading up to the Civil War, though at reduced capacity. And then, in 1866, following the Union victory and emancipation, the impossible became official. According to land records filed in the East Baton Rouge Parish Courthouse, the Whitmore plantation was formally transferred to a Mrs. Adelaide White, described in documents as a free woman of color. The transaction was processed by the same bank that had handled the Whitmore accounts for decades. The same officials who had accepted deposits signed by Samuel Whitmore's hand now processed the transfer of his property to the woman who had taken his place. The same pens, the same ink, the same deliberate blindness, the same willingness not to see. Adelaide White appears in the 1870 census as a widow and property owner. Her neighbors, according to tax records, included former plantation owners now farming smaller parcels of their once vast holdings. The world had turned upside down, and yet some things remained the same. The fiction had evolved. No longer the white plantation mistress, she became instead a free woman of color who had somehow acquired property. Unusual, but not impossible in the Reconstruction era. A new lie to replace the old one. A more acceptable impossibility. Church records from St. Joseph's Catholic Church list Adelaide White as a congregant and contributor from 1867 until her death. The same church records make no mention of Adeline Broussard, nor of the Whitmore family, as if they had never existed at all, as if history itself had agreed to look away. A daguerreotype taken around 1875 shows an elderly woman of African descent dressed plainly but with dignity, seated on the porch of a modest farmhouse. According to notes accompanying the image, she was known locally as Madam White, and was respected for her knowledge of herbal medicine and her willingness to treat both black and white residents of the area. She turned no one away. The notes make no mention of her past, stating only that she came into her property after the war and was known to help former slaves establish themselves with small loans and gifts of seed and livestock. The woman who had once served at Elizabeth Whitmore's beck and call now sat on her own porch, on her own land, a free woman who had carved her freedom from the bones of her oppressors. Adelaide White died on September 12, 1882. The cause of death is listed in parish records as complications of age. She was approximately 60 years old, though exact records of her birth do not exist. Enslaved people were rarely granted the dignity of recorded birthdays. Their lives began when they were purchased and ended when they died or were sold. Everything in between belonged to someone else. Her will, a remarkably detailed document for someone who had once been property rather than a property owner, distributed her modest estate among several families in the area, many of whom were formerly enslaved. The will makes no reference to her life before emancipation. No mention of the Broussard name. No mention of the Whitmores. No mention of that night in August. Just the careful disposition of land and goods accumulated over a lifetime of impossible transformation. She was buried in a small cemetery on what had once been the eastern edge of the Whitmore plantation. Not far, perhaps, from where 5 bodies had been laid to rest in unmarked graves 34 years earlier. The dead keeping company with the dead. Her grave marker bore only a name and 2 dates. Adelaide White, 1833, 1882. At rest. In 1962, during construction of what would later become Interstate 10, workers excavating in the swampland that had once been part of the Whitmore property made a grim discovery. 5 skeletons were recovered from shallow graves. 2 adult males, 1 adult female, and 2 individuals of indeterminate gender. The bones were stained dark by the Louisiana mud that had held them for over a century. The remains were estimated to have been buried for over 100 years. No further investigation was conducted. The remains were eventually reburied in an unmarked section of Highland Cemetery. The police report on the discovery runs to exactly 3 paragraphs. No names, no identification, no attempt to solve a mystery over a century old. Just bones in the mud, just another thing not to see. The small cemetery where Adelaide White was buried was also relocated in 1959 to make way for highway construction. Progress, they called it. According to cemetery records, her grave marker was not among those successfully moved, lost in transit, misplaced, forgotten. Today, her final resting place is unmarked. The woman who had been slave and mistress, victim and avenger, has been erased from the landscape entirely, just as the Whitmores were erased, just as the truth was erased, layer upon layer of forgetting, like sediment settling on the bottom of a river. In 1964, during an interview conducted as part of the Federal Writers Project, a 101-year-old woman named Clara Johnson, who had been born into slavery in East Baton Rouge Parish, was asked if she remembered anything about the Whitmore plantation. After a long silence, during which she seemed to be consulting with memories older than most of the people who would ever hear her words, she replied, "Some stories ain't meant to be told straight out. Some stories get told in the spaces between words, in the things people don't say. That Whitmore place, folks knew what happened there. They just found it easier to look away. And sometimes, looking away is its own kind of seeing. Sometimes the silence tells you everything you need to know." Today, if you drive along Interstate 10, just east of Baton Rouge, you pass directly over the ground where the Whitmore family was buried. Thousands traverse this route daily, their tires rolling over soil that once drank the blood of masters and the tears of slaves. They are unaware of what lies beneath their wheels, unaware of the history compressed into the dirt, unaware of the bones beneath the asphalt. Modern highways, shopping centers, and subdivisions have erased all physical evidence of the Whitmore plantation. Nothing remains of the original structures. No historical markers commemorate the events that took place there. No plaques, no monuments, no acknowledgement. The land has been cleaned, developed, sanitized of its past. Like the society that once chose to participate in Adeline Broussard's impossible fiction, we move through landscapes haunted by histories we have collectively agreed to forget. But some stories refuse to remain buried. They find their way back to the surface, like bodies in shallow graves after heavy rain. They whisper to us from old documents and faded photographs. They speak through the mouths of those who lived to tell them. They remind us that the most disturbing horrors are not supernatural, but entirely human. What makes this case so disturbing is not just the acts themselves, not just the poison, not just the bodies in the swamp. It is the response to those acts, an entire community's decision to participate in a fiction, rather than confront a reality that threatened their understanding of the world. This collective self-deception, this agreement to see what could not exist rather than acknowledge what did, reveals how fragile our social constructs can be, and how desperately we will work to maintain them, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Perhaps most unsettling is the realization that this capacity for collective self-deception is not confined to the past. We too participate in fictions that allow us to maintain our understanding of how the world functions. We too look away from truths that threaten our sense of order. We too choose comfort over confrontation, convenient lies over unbearable truths. And like the society that chose not to see Adeline Broussard sitting in Elizabeth Whitmore's place, we may not recognize our own delusions until long after they have shaped our reality. Judge Martin Lambert, in his final journal entry dated January 18, 1852, just 3 months before his death, wrote words that echo across the centuries. "What frightens me most is not that such things can happen. It is that we can look directly at them and see nothing at all." And perhaps the most haunting question of all, how many other Adeline Broussards have been erased from our history? How many other unbearable truths have we collectively agreed not to see? How many bodies lie beneath the roads we travel every day? How many silences do we mistake for peace? The most terrifying monsters are not those lurking in the shadows. They are the ones we refuse to acknowledge, even when they are standing directly in front of us, even when they are sitting at our dinner table, even when they are wearing our clothes, even when they are us. In 1965, Dr. Eleanor Pritchard, a historian specializing in antebellum Louisiana, attempted to publish a comprehensive study of the Whitmore case. Her research, drawing on many of the same sources cited in this account, was met with resistance from both academic institutions and local historical societies. Her manuscript was rejected by 14 publishers before being indefinitely shelved. Not out of shame for the institution of slavery, which has been well documented and acknowledged, but because the Whitmore case represents something far more threatening. A complete inversion of the established order that was tacitly accepted by the very society it subverted. Perhaps most revealing was the response Pritchard received from the East Baton Rouge Historical Society when she requested access to any records they might have pertaining to the Whitmore family. The Society's director replied with a brief note stating simply, No such family is recorded in our archives. Even in 1965, even a century after the events, the looking away continues. Some silences are louder than screams. Some forgetting is more deliberate than memory. And some stories, no matter how deeply we bury them, refuse to stay underground. Share this story, because while a single voice remembers, no injustice will ever be truly forgotten. Subscribe, leave your thoughts in the comments, and help these buried histories find their way back to the light. The dead are waiting to be heard.